In November 1941, the Desert War hinged on one besieged port, Tobruk. If it stayed trapped, the Axis could keep threatening Egypt and the Suez Lifeline, while the British Eighth Army bled trucks, fuel, and morale in the sand. So the Allies launched Operation Crusader, a relief attempt built on fast armor, imperfect radios, and a plan that assumed the enemy would react slowly. Instead, Rommel moved first, turning open desert into a maze of ambush guns and sudden counterstrokes. What followed wasn't a clean, tank battle. It was a rolling crisis, where the side that understood exhaustion, fuel, and timing would decide whether Tobruk lived, or the whole campaign flipped. Operation Crusader did not begin with confidence. It began with pressure, strategic pressure, political pressure, and the relentless pressure of a siege that had been draining men and material since April 1941. Tobruk mattered because it was a deep-water port on the Libyan coast, and ports in the desert are more powerful than divisions. Whoever controlled Tobruk could shorten supply lines by hundreds of miles. Whoever failed to control it had to haul everything, fuel, shells, food, across a road network that barely deserved the name. The siege had already become a symbol, defended first by Australians and later by other Allied formations, but symbols don't refuel tanks. The practical reality was simple. If Tobruk stayed bottled up, the Axis could keep the initiative, and Egypt would remain within reach. And there was another uncomfortable truth the British command couldn't ignore. 2 previous relief efforts in 1941 had failed. The reasons were debated, but one lesson stood out. British armor had often been used poorly, too scattered, too eager to fight tank versus tank, while infantry and anti-tank guns shaped the battlefield. By late 1941, the British had shipped reinforcements, trained hard, and prepared a larger, more coordinated offensive to do what earlier attempts could not. Crusader was meant to be the corrective. The plan leaned on a familiar desert idea: go around the enemy's prepared frontier positions instead of smashing straight through them. British and Commonwealth forces would strike west from Egypt, swing into the open spaces south of the main Axis defenses, and force the German-Italian armored forces to fight on ground the British chose. In broad strokes, XXX Corps carried the main armored thrust, while 13 Corps pushed on the frontier positions and helped secure the northern flank. Meanwhile, Tobruk's garrison would break out at the right moment, time to meet the relieving force and open a corridor. But here's the twist. Crusader assumed the desert would behave like a map: clean lines, clear objectives, and a predictable enemy response. The desert never cooperates. It distorts distance and time. It punishes hesitation and overconfidence equally. And in 1941, it punished communication above all. On November 18, 1941, the Eighth Army began the offensive. It was designed, in part, to surprise Rommel, and it did. Yet the first days immediately exposed the brittleness of British control at speed. Armor moved fast, but not always together. Units sought contact, found it, and then discovered they were fighting a different battle than the one the planners had imagined. The early fighting around places like Sidi Rezegh and the airfields near Tobruk became a confusing, exhausting series of collisions. British armored brigades hunted German tanks as if they were the decisive target. The Afrika Korps often let those hunts happen, drawing armor into fields of fire where anti-tank guns and artillery could do the killing. In the Western Desert, the gun line could be more dangerous than the tank line, and the Germans and Italians used that logic relentlessly. Hold on to that idea, because it explains why Crusader felt like a victory and a disaster at the same time. British tanks could be brave, fast, and numerous, yet still bleed out if employed in isolated packets. The British had modern cruiser tanks and American-supplied light tanks, but technology alone didn't solve tactical structure. If armor arrived without infantry support, without artillery coordination, and without clear reconnaissance, it could be funneled into an anti-tank screen that turns speed into vulnerability. Meanwhile, Tobruk waited. Inside the perimeter, the garrison wasn't simply defending, it was preparing to move. The Breakout was not a desperate last lunge, it was a planned component of the operation, meant to synchronize with the relief forces and crack the siege from both sides. But synchronization required the one thing the desert constantly eroded: reliable timing. Around the frontier, 13 Corps worked the hard, methodical problem of strongpoints and roads, names like Capuzzo, Solum, Halfaya, Bardia, places that sound small until you realize how they anchor supply and movement across a blank landscape. These positions mattered because they were not only tactical obstacles, they were nodes in a logistical system. Clear them, and you reduce the threat to your rear. Leave them, and every mile west becomes riskier. But here's the twist. While the British were trying to fight their plan, Rommel was already trying to break it. By late November, both sides were making decisions under fog. British commanders received reports that were incomplete, delayed, or contradictory. The battle became a test of whether leadership could see through the noise, whether it could decide what mattered, the tank count in the moment, or the supply reality a week ahead. In that environment, Rommel saw an opportunity. If the British rear could be thrown into confusion, if depots, lines of communication, and command posts could be threatened, the offensive might stall even if British armor remained numerically strong. So he chose a move that looks reckless until you remember the desert scale, a drive back toward the Egyptian frontier, striking into the British rear in what became known as the dash to the wire. The effect was immediate chaos, units diverted, headquarters displaced, rumors spreading faster than confirmed orders. This is the moment where many offensives die, not from a single defeat, but from loss of coherence. Tanks can be replaced. Confidence cannot. Yet Rommel's dash had a cost. By moving toward the frontier, he was also stepping away from Tobruk, away from the original siege focus, while stretching his own supplies. His maneuver bought disruption, but it risked allowing the British to regroup, consolidate, and finally connect with the garrison. In other words, the move created a window. And the window mattered because Tobruk's defenders weren't waiting for permission. They were waiting for opportunity. As the swirling desert battles continued, Allied pressure and movement began to create something tangible, the possibility of a corridor. Not a sweeping breakthrough, but a narrow, hard-won link, road, track, and open ground, through which men and supplies could flow. When that corridor appeared, the siege's logic began to crack. But here's the twist. The closer the Allies came to Tobruk, the more fragile they became. Their armor had taken losses. Their formations were tired. Their logistics were under strain. And now came the worst kind of battlefield dilemma, one that has nothing to do with courage and everything to do with control. Because inside the British command, a crisis was forming. Reports from the battlefield suggested a grinding stalemate. Some units mauled, others intact, some advancing, others retreating. Decision-makers feared they were losing too many tanks too fast. They had begun an operation meant to destroy Axis armor and relieve Tobruk, but the desert had turned it into a test of survival and judgment. So the question became, do you press on, risking further armor losses to keep the initiative, or do you pause, consolidate, and possibly lose the one chance to lift Tobruk while Rommel is displaced? That argument was not theoretical. It was urgent, and it polled in the highest levels of command. Operation Crusader had reached its first major hinge point, a decision about tempo. Mini cliffhanger setup begins here, because what happens next is not a dramatic single battle. It's a leadership gamble under pressure. At the end of Module 1, imagine the map as the commanders saw it. Tobruk still besieged, British armor battered and scattered, Rommel disrupting the rear, frontier strongpoints still complicating movement, and time running out, because supply and fatigue don't wait. The plan is still alive, but it's wobbling. And then comes the cliffhanger. The British must decide whether to keep fighting forward, toward Tobruk, while Rommel's maneuver throws confusion behind them, or risk the siege continuing by slowing down at the exact moment speed matters. Operation Crusader opened on November 18, 1941 with one clear aim: relieve Tobruk and break the Axis hold on Cyrenaica. But within days, the desert turned the offensive into a rolling crisis. Tank fights around airfields and ridges, frontier strongpoints tugging at the British flank, and Rommel's sudden dash to the wire, throwing the British rear into confusion. Now the stakes are sharper than ever. If the 8th Army loses tempo, Tobruk stays trapped and Egypt remains threatened. If it presses forward while battered and disorganized, it risks a collapse in armor and command control. The next phase is where Crusader either becomes a turning point or a cautionary tale. Now we get to the part of Crusader that makes historians argue the operation didn't win by being clean. It won by being stubborn, by absorbing confusion without surrendering the core objective. Rommel's dash toward the frontier had rattled the British system, but it also forced him to reckon with a problem he could not outmaneuver forever: logistics. Every mile east or west mattered because it was paid for in fuel and maintenance. The Afrika Korps was dangerous not only because of tactics, but because it could strike quickly and then vanish into the desert. Yet when supply faltered, that same mobility became a trap. The British, too, were living on arithmetic. Tanks needed fuel, tracks, and recovery vehicles. A unit that had tanks on paper could be immobile in reality. A formation that looked intact from a distance could be exhausted up close. Crusader became a contest to see which side's system broke first. But here's the twist: Tobruk was no longer simply a fortress. It was becoming a lever. Late November brought the key development the Allies needed: a linkage between the relieving force and a breakout from Tobruk. The corridor around Ed Duda, southeast of the town, became the physical manifestation of the operation's purpose. It wasn't that the Axis instantly stopped fighting. It was that the siege could no longer function as a closed ring. Once that corridor existed, Tobruk could be supplied and reinforced in ways it hadn't been for months. This moment matters for retention because it's easy to assume link up equals victory. In Crusader, link up equals a new problem. Can you hold the corridor long enough for the siege to truly end? Because the Axis response was predictable and ferocious. If the corridor could be cut, the siege could reform. If it could be held, Rommel would be forced into an ugly choice: keep fighting near Tobruk with weakening supply lines, or pull back to preserve the army. In the same breath, the British command had to manage another reality: leadership under stress. Crusader's early phases exposed confusion and disagreement in the 8th Army's direction, and command changed hands during the operation, one more indicator of how precarious the situation felt from the top. Hold that thought, because here's where the operation's turning point truly lives: not in a single ridgeline, but in the moment when attrition and fuel become more decisive than maneuver. As the days pushed into early December, Rommel faced a shrinking set of options. Continuing the siege and battling around the Tobruk approaches required steady supplies, especially fuel and ammunition, delivered along long, vulnerable routes. Tobruk's stubborn resistance had already complicated Axis supply ambitions for months. Now, with Crusader opening and the corridor threatening his position, the siege became less a prize and more a weight. The British exploited that pressure. Not with a perfect encirclement, but with sustained force, keeping enough pressure on the battlefield to prevent the Axis from restoring a stable perimeter around Tobruk. The desert battles continued, but the direction of the campaign began to tilt. But here's the twist: victory in the desert often looks like retreat. In early December, the siege was effectively broken and then formally lifted as the link-up solidified and the Axis position became untenable. Imperial War Museums notes the siege was lifted on December 10, 1941 during Operation Crusader, tied to the link-up at Ed Duda. That date matters because it marks the strategic payoff. Tobruk was no longer a trapped symbol, it was usable again as a logistical asset. And the moment Tobruk becomes usable, Rommel's position changes. He can still fight brilliantly, but he must fight while the enemy's supply situation improves and his own worsens. From there, the Axis begins to withdraw, first shortening lines and stepping back to more defensible positions. This wasn't a collapse in the cinematic sense. It was a withdrawal forced by constraints, a recognition that the risks of staying outweighed the gains. Now zoom out to the why it mattered layer, because Crusader is not just a desert episode, it's a lesson in how campaigns pivot. First, Crusader proved that Tobruk's siege had been a strategic hinge. The siege wasn't merely about taking a port, it was about controlling the supply geometry of the entire theater. When the siege ended, the Allies gained freedom of movement. The Axis lost the ability to threaten Egypt with the same confidence. Second, Crusader exposed the limits of fighting armor as an isolated arm. The British had to learn, painfully, that tanks alone were not a solution. They needed combined arms: infantry to hold ground, artillery to shape fights, engineers to keep movement possible, and air power to pressure supply and maneuver. Australian War Memorial commentary on Crusader's context emphasizes the earlier failures and the push to correct armor employment, an undercurrent that runs through this entire campaign. Third, Crusader changed the campaign rhythm. It didn't end the Desert War, far from it. The back and forth would continue, and the Axis would later regain momentum. But Crusader demonstrated that Rommel could be forced to retreat when supply and operational pressure converged, and that the Eighth Army could survive a chaotic battle and still achieve the strategic objective. But here's the twist, the final one. Crusader's legacy is not the Allies finally figured it out. It's the Allies learned enough to keep adapting. They learned that surprise is fragile, that speed can become isolation, that the desert punishes any plan that depends on perfect information, and that the most important victories sometimes arrive as a corridor held at great strain, a port unbottled, and an enemy compelled to choose preservation over ambition. That is the payoff. Tobruk relieved, Cyrenaica contested anew, and the Western Desert Campaign reshaped by an operation that succeeded not because it was smooth, but because it stayed focused on what actually mattered. 2 to 4 sentences, story-based, includes comment prompt. Operation Crusader reminds us that in war, the biggest gamble isn't always a charge. It's the decision to keep going when the plan is breaking and the fuel gauge is dropping. If that turning point, pressing on toward Tobruk despite the chaos, stood out to you, tap like, share this with a friend who loves campaign-level history, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Comment below, which mattered more in Crusader, the dash to the wire, or the decision to hold the Tobruk corridor at all costs?